Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Today we're looking at a battle that was certainly significant to the people involved, but that has left very little in the way of stories to come down to us 3.5 millennia later. This is another one of those battles that we don't know much more than it happened, and more or less when it happened. The Hittite sack of Babylon around 1595 BCE. Anyway, that's about all the complaining I'm going to do about how little information we have. So what do we know? Well, we know the Amorite dynasty in Babylon, the same dynasty Hammurabi was part of, was on its last legs at the turn of the 16th century BCE. Babylon's last Amorite king, Samsu-ditana, came to power around 1625 BCE and seems to have had a pretty uneventful reign right up until the Hittites showed up in 1595 BCE. After that, the Amorites drop off the map, replaced by a people called the Kassites. And we know the Hittite king, Mursili I, came to power around 1620 BCE and marched south with his army in 1595 BCE. He conquered Aleppo and Akkad, then continued down the Euphrates and raided Babylon. But he didn't stay there, and he doesn't seem to have left a garrison. Instead, he sacked the city, then turned around and went home. And in about 1590 BCE, Mursili was assassinated and replaced by his brother-in-law, Huntili I. And that's about it. So, it looks like we're going to have to make up another war story. First, we need to back up a little more and talk about our participants. We talked about the Babylonians when we discussed the campaigns of Hammurabi, but just to recap, the Amorites established the city of Babylon sometime around 1894 BCE, and their most famous ruler, Hammurabi, ruled between 1792 and 1750 BCE, and seems to have spent a good bit of his time and energy kicking the shit out of his neighbors. In the century and a half since then, his descendants have been pretty much living the high life and losing the territory he conquered. First they lost Sumer, then Assyria. By the time Samsu-ditana became king around 1625 BCE, the Babylonian kingdom was about the same size it had been before Hammurabi came to the throne. But the city itself was still immensely wealthy, which probably goes a long way to explaining why folks wanted to sack it. I feel like I need to put in a little historical note here. The Babylon of Hammurabi and the Amorites, and after today's battle the Kassites, is not the Babylon you're probably familiar with in history. It's the same city, but the Hanging Gardens and the Jewish exile all happened under what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 600s and 500s BCE. So that's still about 1,000 years in the future from this period. So that's Babylon in a nutshell. Who are the Hittites then? You probably heard of the Hittites. They're mentioned several times in the Old Testament, and most high school world history classes mention them between the Sumerians and the Assyrians, even if they don't bother to mention the Akkadians. We introduced the Hittites in the episode on the Battle of Kadesh, but to recap, the Hittites grew up around the city of Hattusa in central Anatolia, the region the Greeks called Asia Minor, and that's now the nation of Turkey. Their culture seems to have grown up in that region around 1900 BCE, and by the time Mursili I became king in 1620 BCE, they were feeling their oats. When I was taking world history in school, I learned that they conquered their neighbors because they knew how to make iron weapons, but we don't think that anymore. The Hittites didn't have any more skill at working or extracting iron than any other people in the early to mid-2nd millennium BCE. Their armies would have been armed with bronze just like everybody else. What they did have was a chariot that was far superior than the clumsy war carts the Sumerians had invented. It looks like the two-wheeled light chariot pulled by horses made its way into Anatolia from the steppe north of the Black Sea sometime around 1700 BCE, and the Hittites immediately set to work learning how to use it. So when Mursili took over a century later, they were not yet quite the badasses at chariot warfare that they would become by the time of the Battle of Kadesh, but they were plenty badass enough to get their neighbors' attention. And now let's do a little detective work. Why the hell would a Hittite king march more than 1,200 miles down the Euphrates to sack a town and then not bother to conquer the territory? What was the bad blood between the Hittites and Babylon, or between Mursili and Samsu-Ditana? And if it was about bad blood, why did he stop to take Aleppo and Akkad? And did he also hit Mari on his way downriver? Or was the bad blood between Mursili and somebody else entirely? And where the hell do the Kassites come in? Right, so let's try to guess at some of these answers. Mursili's predecessor was his grandfather, Hattusili I, the first king of the Hittites. Hattusili seems to have spent most of his reign fighting, extending the Hittite Empire across central Anatolia and campaigning south as far as Aleppo, which he apparently attacked but didn't capture. He took a pretty realistic view of conquest, setting up his sons as rulers of the cities he conquered in order to consolidate his control over the region. But his sons, or maybe their advisors, rebelled, and putting down that rebellion was his last war. He made it home to Hattusa, victorious but mortally wounded, and lived long enough to send his sons the big F.U. by naming his grandson Mursili as his heir. Or his sons had been killed in the rebellion. Or he had killed them putting it down, and Mursili was the closest relative still available for him to name. The succession is fuzzy, but the result is clear. Mursili became Mursili I, king of the Hittites, and Hattusili's sons, including Mursili's father, are not mentioned again. And it looks like Mursili was still a child when he took the throne, which means he got to grow up hearing about what a badass his grandfather was, and maybe also hearing about how he needed to be a better ruler than his father, or maybe a better ruler than his mother's brothers, who may or may not have been traitors to his grandfather. Yeah, no pressure there, Mursili. We don't have much information about Mursili's reign, except that he spent the last few years of it campaigning. He sacked both Aleppo and Babylon, but his aim seems to have been plunder instead of conquest, because he sent slaves and treasure home to Hattusa from both cities. Aleppo makes sense, especially since his grandfather already had history there. So why did he keep going all the way to Babylon? Well, I have some thoughts about that. It could have been purely pragmatic. His kingdom was only about 100 years old, and he was surrounded by immensely wealthy kingdoms. Maybe he just wanted some of their stuff. Maybe he saw samples of art pieces or crafts from Mari or Babylon and decided he wanted to help himself. Maybe he wanted to recruit artisans from some of the older kingdoms so he could build his own tradition of Hittite art and beauty. Maybe he just wanted to meet the rulers of Mesopotamia face to face, make treaties with them, maybe talk them out of a daughter. Maybe he was focused outward. He wanted to announce to the world that the Hittites were in the house, sack some cities, secure some tribute, as you do. Maybe he was focused inward. His grandfather charged him to continue his work, or his cousins kept questioning his right to rule, or a woman laughed at him at the wrong moment. Maybe somebody told him he would never measure up to his grandfather, so he spent the rest of his reign proving he could. Hell, maybe he heard a story about Sargon or Hammurabi and decided he wanted some of that glory. Or maybe he was a spoiled, petulant brat who never learned you can't have everything. Maybe he was a spoiled brat with huge ambition and a lot of military talent like Alexander. Or maybe he was a spoiled brat with a talented general working for him. So many possibilities, and the real answer is probably something else entirely, something I haven't thought of, and we're not likely ever to know for sure. But if we're going to make up a story here, we need to pick one and move forward. So let's get on with it. No shit, there they were. We have no idea how old Mursili was when he took the throne, so we're going to say he was 10. There must have been some kind of regency situation, but I have no idea what it might have been. But for 10 years or so, Mursili ruled in name only, reminded every day what a great ruler and conqueror his father had been, but unable to do a damn thing about it. And finally he came of age and inherited the throne in his own right. There would have been a grand celebration for his coronation, feasting and music and games. Important people from the neighboring kingdoms would have been invited, maybe even as far as Babylon. But invited or not, a delegation from Babylon showed up, because Samsu-Ditana has trouble with Mari, just like Ebla and Kish did, because Mari is just too perfectly situated on the Euphrates not to take advantage of the trade that passes through. And Babylon understands that the best way to minimize the amount of shit Mari can stir up is to make sure it has as many friends as possible upstream. So Samsu-Ditana sends a delegation to Mursili's birthday celebration and coronation, and one of the people he sends is his youngest daughter. An offer of marriage will be a common way to cement alliances between states for thousands of years yet. But Mursili, as mindful as he is of his grandfather's legacy, is a little bit of a man-child. He's been told for half his life that he's the king of the greatest power on the face of the earth, just like every other child king of every other state, whether it's true or not. His people have humored him as far as possible, indulging him with whatever he wants as long as it doesn't hurt the kingdom. He's been schooled in warfare and governance and finance and diplomacy, but the only one that's really taken is the war stuff. He's shown a real talent for war and conquest, at least in the limited situations he's been exposed to. Well, he takes one look at Samsu-Ditana's youngest daughter, exotic, beautiful, richly dressed, representing the wealthiest city in the world he knows, and he's smitten. This is the perfect woman, and by the gods, he deserves to have her. He talks to her, maybe compares himself favorably to her famous ancestor Hammurabi, and before she can control herself, she giggles. That pisses him off, of course, and he runs his mouth, and he manages to piss off the leader of the delegation, Samsu-Ditana's second vizier, who decides an alliance with these barbarians just isn't worth the pain in his ass. And before Mursili knows what's going on, the Babylonians have packed up their shit and left. They left him a very nice gift, a cart full of gold and exotic food and rich fabrics. But they left. Mursili has never been snubbed so hard. He swears vengeance against Babylon. But it's a long way away, and a king has responsibilities, and he can't just take his whole army and leave his kingdom unguarded for the year or more that it would take to march all the way down there. So 15 years go by. He's an indifferent ruler, and his people don't thrive under his rule, but they don't starve either. And he builds up his army and consolidates his grandfather's conquests and manages to add a few more cities to his empire. The kingdom of Yamhad, with its capital at Aleppo, is a particular thorn in his side, constantly talking shit and refusing to pay the tribute they've agreed to. The Yamhad king even sends him a letter saying he wouldn't give Mursili his daughter either. And finally, Mursili has had enough of their shit. He gathers his army and sends a demand out across his entire empire. Every family with more than one able-bodied son older than 15 must send him a son. That's going to allow him to build up his army without crippling the Hittites' ability to harvest their crops while he's gone. So, he marches against Aleppo with one of the biggest hammers the world has ever seen, bolstered by the light chariots everybody in Mesopotamia has heard of by now, but few have seen in action. But chariots only do you any good as long as your enemy comes out from behind his walls. So Mursili has to figure out how to get the Yamhad to come out and meet him in the field. Turns out that's not so hard to do. He attacks the farms outside Aleppo, attacks the settlements all through the Yamhad kingdom that aren't protected behind walls. In an age when news travels as fast as a human can run, a chariot army can get ahead of the news so your army's on the scene before your enemy knows you're coming. Yes, the Yamhad would have had messengers on horseback, and they would have been able to move faster than chariots. But those would have been based in the cities and worked for the nobility. You know, the guys who could afford to employ them. Your basic farmer would have had donkeys or maybe oxen. Nothing that could outrun a chariot. So, as long as you hit small towns and isolated farms, you can do a lot of damage before the king in Aleppo figures out what's going on and sends his army out to deal with you. But eventually, he does figure it out and sends his army out to find the Hittites. And that's just what Mursili was waiting for. because the Yamhad king made two mistakes. First, he assumed he was dealing with a raiding party, or maybe a few raiding parties who wouldn't stand and fight, but would have to be hunted down and chased out of Yamhad, or preferably destroyed. And second, he underestimated both the numbers and capabilities of the Hittite chariots. So the forces he sent out consisted of small, fast units, scouts on horseback who could find the enemy and report to the charioteers they were assigned to, who would then run down the Hittite chariots and kill them or chase them off before they could do much more damage. In short, he did exactly what Mursili expected him to do. Now, if you watched the episode on the Battle of Kadesh, you know that the Hittite chariots were heavier than their Egyptian counterparts and designed more for shock effect than for missile attack. But Kadesh is still 300 years in the future from the attack on Aleppo, and it doesn't look like the Hittites have hit on that formula yet. So their chariots will be pretty close in terms of capabilities to what the Yamhad have, except they have more of them. And they've been masters of chariot combat since the chariot first appeared in this part of the world. So when the Yamhad's little units of a few chariots make contact with Mursili's army, they learn pretty quick that they're not facing a handful of raiding parties. They're facing the whole fucking Hittite army, all Mursili's chariots and all his infantry as well. And they learn this way too late to be able to do a damn thing about it. So Yamhad's chariot forces are gone. And now the king has to make a choice. Does he march out with his infantry and face the Hittites in the field, exposing his whole army to defeat? Or does he hole up in Aleppo and let Mursili devastate the rest of his kingdom, hoping he'll eventually get tired of it and go home? Well, the king of Yamhad is a responsible king, and he does the responsible thing. He marches what's left of his army out to meet the Hittites in the field. And shortly after that, the Hittite army is taking a long weekend in Aleppo. They take everything they want, pretty much everything that's light enough to carry out of the city. If they can't carry it away, they set fire to it. If they can't do either of those things, they do their best to knock it over, pull it down, undermine it, whatever they can think of to break it. The point is, by the time they're finished, there's not much left of Aleppo. And when they're finished in Aleppo, Mursili decides he's not ready to go home yet. So he sends his booty back to Hattusa under guard and starts marching his army down the Euphrates. There's nothing in the records we have about Turka or Mari or Akkad or any of the cities on the Euphrates between Anatolia and Babylon. But there's no way Mursili could march 800 miles downriver without interacting with them in some way. So in my story, he's going to take this army his grandfather built and that he's spent the last 15 years perfecting, and he's going to see what it can do. So the next town they come to is Turka. Now Mursili has no bad blood with Turka, not like he did with Aleppo, so maybe he's satisfied with a hefty tribute payment, and probably a pledge not to move against him after he leaves. And then he figures, he's come this far, might as well keep going. Now he's managed to pick up a couple engineers in Turka who know how to work with the river, and they're about to become his ace in the hole, because he's heard the legends of Hammurabi, and he's got the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. How ironic would it be if he could use Hammurabi's own techniques to get his revenge on Babylon? But first, he's going to practice on Mari. He's going to take down one of the biggest cities on the Euphrates without ever endangering his army. And under the engineer's direction, his army starts digging canals all around the city, widening the ones that are there, throwing up levees, and the water starts rising. And the city fathers of Mari, being smart and resourceful, offer terms. So for the third time, Mursili sends a train of carts loaded with wealth back to Hattusa. And he keeps going. It's time for payback. He's going to show Babylon, their king, their city, that jackass of a vizier, that snooty-ass giggling princess, exactly what it feels like to be humiliated. So they keep going. If not farther than any Hittite has ever been, then at least farther than any Hittite army has ever been. And as the grunt walks, they travel something like 1,200 miles in total. That's probably 80 or maybe even 100 days of walking, not counting rest days or the days the army spent sacking cities. And they're going to have to walk it again on the way back, uphill. And eventually they make it to Babylon. And they start digging canals and building levees, and the water level starts rising. Now, the water table at Babylon is already pretty high, high enough that most of the kinds of artifacts we find at other Mesopotamian sites haven't been preserved there. So it doesn't take long for Babylon to start flooding. And the city fathers, or the king, or whoever's in charge tries to offer terms. But you know what's coming. Wasili isn't interested in terms, not this time. And it's not like Babylon can wait him out. So he settles in and lets the city flood. And sooner or later the gates open and people start trying to escape. And with the Hittite army camped outside the walls, those folks are easy to round up. And with the gates secured and open, they can knock down the levees and let the waters recede and enter Babylon at their leisure. And they've been marching for 100 days. There is no way in hell they're going to rush this one. No, they're going to take their time, and they're going to do a good, thorough job. Any loot they can find and carry, they're going to take. Any food they can eat, any booze they can drink, they're going to eat it and drink it. Anybody they like, they're going to take with them back to Hattusa after they've done what they like with them. Anybody they don't like is shit out of luck. That almost certainly includes Samsu-Ditana the king, and the smart-ass second vizier if he's still alive and in town, and the snooty princess if Wasili can find her, although she's probably been married off to another city by now. Point is, they're going to be thorough, and by the time they're finished, there's not going to be a lot left of Babylon. And that's where the Kassites come in. Remember them? So after Wasili sacked Babylon, they occupied it and stood up a whole new dynasty. We don't know quite when or how it happened, but it seems like Wasili had no interest in actually occupying Babylon. So he took what he wanted, destroyed what he could, and left. And either the Kassites were allied with him and he gave them the city, or they just moved into the vacuum he left behind him when he destroyed it. And just like always, we don't know. But from about 1595 BCE until about 1155 BCE, the Kassites ruled in Babylon. In fact, they were the longest reigning dynasty to occupy the city. Wasili, on the other hand, was not the longest reigning king of the Hittites. It seemed like he stayed king until he got back to Hattusa, when he was promptly assassinated by his brother-in-law, Hantili, who replaced him as king to become Hantili I. So I guess there's no happy ending when you're a leader who neglects his country. I mean, he had a hell of an adventure, did something few other Bronze Age rulers ever did, and he was probably a pretty good military commander to get his men to follow him so far. But I'm guessing he didn't win any prizes for ruling Hattusa. It's a pattern we're going to see pretty often. A poor leader at home, or maybe just an absentee, and a genius on the battlefield. And once again, we don't know enough to rate this battle against the principals. If he did it the way we talked about, by flooding the city, he gets high marks for surprise and security. But that's about all we can tell. And we really can't even tell that. So, that's going to do it for the sack of Babylon, 1595 BCE. If you enjoyed this episode, give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your nerdy friends about me. See you next time for another thrilling episode. Till then, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.